Good afternoon. This is Daniel here with Cop Watch TV. Just want to welcome everyone into our live show. We're going to talk about some of the most interesting cases in policing from the last week or so. I'm real curious to see where everybody is watching from today, so go ahead and put that in the chat while we are getting started. And again, my name is Daniel. You can go ahead and follow me just about everywhere over at Police Law News. And more importantly, if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, make sure that you do so, just so you know when we go live with our shows every single week and to watch the raw body camera footage that we put up every single week. A little bit of a roadmap of where we're going. Actually, the first case that we're going to talk about today is an incident from some body camera footage that we posted earlier this week that is really interesting to watch. Let's see. Looks like we got Kate is from North Carolina. Tyrannical Tours is from Florida. Autistic Shill. Hey, how's it going? So yeah, put in the chat there where you guys are from. Really curious. And also, as I'm going through some of these cases, and two of the cases that we're going to cover today are pretty controversial cases. The last case is a case that I've covered before. However, there is a pretty significant update, and I didn't think it was going to be, but it's probably been one of the most controversial and most argued about cases that we've had over the last year. So that's going to be the last case we do. And also, one of the officer-involved shootings that I'm going to talk about today is a case where an officer is actually on trial right now for an officer-involved shooting. So we're going to go ahead and talk about and discuss that case as well. But all right, so the first case I want to talk about, again, this is a video that we posted over here on Cop Watch TV. We got some body camera footage from Lexington, Oklahoma. So let me tell you about what happened on this case. And you know what? This is really pretty much just like Super Troopers in real life. When you have one agency fighting another agency in public on body camera video, instead of dealing with like an actual threat that's taking place. It's absolutely pretty crazy. Maybe we'll go ahead and put the link to this video in the chat just in case you haven't seen it. But essentially, this is a case where in Lexington, Oklahoma, a Lexington City police officer initiates a traffic stop on a vehicle that's traveling about 30 miles over the speed limit. I think it's about 85 and 55. And from what I can tell on the body camera video, it doesn't look like there's any kind of a government plate or anything to indicate that this was a police car. It looks like a minivan. That's what it looks like. It looks like some kind of a minivan SUV that was pulled over. As the police officer makes contact with the driver informs the police officer that he's actually the county sheriff and he's on the way to a SWAT call. And it's at that point that the officer says, well, I didn't know that there was a SWAT call in the area. So it was at that point that he doesn't write a ticket. He doesn't write a ticket or anything like that. He doesn't write a ticket. The sheriff goes on his way to the SWAT call, and the officer radios it in to dispatch. And, I'm just going to do a little bit of a tangent here because I'm really curious to see what other police officers here think. But, I guess if it were me, if I stopped a car and it was an officer who was going to a SWAT call out in the area, I guess my first thought would be like, hey, do you guys need anything? Can we help? Have you notified our dispatch? Is there any way that we can help? And that's where my mind would go. But correct me if I'm wrong, or anyone who's watched the video, put in the chat. To me, it seems like that the officer is almost offended that he wasn't told or he wasn't informed that there was a SWAT call in the neighborhood. And again, to me, that's just crazy. I'm used to police officers because where I just retired from, the Albuquerque Police Department, we have a county sheriff. The Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office is right next to Albuquerque Police, and there are a lot of areas that are pretty much on the border. And at least from my experience and working 20 years with the Albuquerque Police Department, it's very rare for police officers fighting over who wants to take primary on a call. If anything, the two different agencies are fighting because they don't want to take primary on a call, because they both have a lot of other shit to do. So again, the idea that this officer wants to be involved in this and is upset that his police department hasn't been told, to me, that's just crazy. I guess that would just never happen. If I stopped a county officer or a deputy with the county who was going to a SWAT call and they say, hey, I'm going to SWAT call, anything? No, good. Have a good time. Awesome. And I'll go back to work. The last thing that I want to do, I'm not looking to give myself any more work. And that's pretty much been my experience. But this is a smaller town, so maybe that's not the case there. So what ends up happening is the sheriff goes to the SWAT call out, and several different police officers with the city, they end up on the SWAT call as well. And these basically, they have an argument where it's basically a couple different police officers and a couple different deputies with the sheriff's department pretty much have a yelling and a screaming match. And at one point, there's a lieutenant with the sheriff's department who really has to be held back because he's so upset with the officers from the police department who are there on scene, kind of giving them shit because they didn't tell them, they didn't inform them about the SWAT call. And I just think, like, is an argument like this, like in public, like they were there to conduct a SWAT call on someone who had, a felony warrant. So it's almost like having this argument was more important than actually getting the bad guy into custody, which is just crazy. So I just wanted to let you guys know about that video. If you haven't watched already, it's a short video. We put the link in the chat. It is incredible video, and honestly, this is just like, again, this is like Super Troopers in real life. So why don't you go ahead and watch it, and then either on this video or on that video, if you want to go ahead and let us know who you think is at fault. I'm going to tell you what I think. I think that both police departments are at fault. I think that the county sheriff, I think that the actual police officer with Lexington, that he probably should have just minded his own business, and then also the sheriff's department, once the police officers got on scene, they really didn't have to be assholes. Cajun Randy says childish temper tantrum. I think it's also fair to say that a lot of the comments on this video. So go ahead and interact with them on the link that we just posted. But some of these police officers, believe it or not, and this is going to be a real shock to some people, aren't in the best shape. We did have a comment that made us laugh. Someone said that this video is like a Meal Team 6. So definitely go ahead and check that out. It's an incredible video. All right, so the next case I'm gonna talk about, this actually comes from Columbus, Ohio, and this is a case I'm gonna talk about because the officer actually is, not only is he facing murder charges, he's actually on trial right now. So I believe that there was a break in the trial, and that it's going to continue here on Tuesday. I learned about this case from Officer Ben, Thoughts of a Police Officer. It's a channel that I follow on Instagram and also on Twitter. But Officer Ben, he's an officer in Columbus, Ohio, and he posts a lot. And he was talking about this case. That's kind of where I learned about it from, because being here in the southwest part of the country, I don't always hear about every single officer involved shooting, or even when police officers are on trial for crimes, or they're being prosecuted for something. Even though this is what I do, I follow these issues, I don't always hear about everything. But it was Officer Ben who told me about this one. So basically, this happened in Columbus, Ohio last year, and essentially it happened with a guy named Officer Jason Mead. So Officer Jason Mead, he was part of a task force working with the U.S. Marshals. And essentially, what happens in these task forces, it's typically federal agents, and then usually they take a couple different police officers from a couple different police departments. So you could see a situation where maybe there's 4 or 5 U.S. Marshals, and they go to some of the surrounding areas. Maybe Columbus Police will give them a couple officers, and then, you know what, I haven't been to Ohio since I was a kid, so I don't have any idea what other towns are around Columbus, Ohio. But, then, there's a couple of the surrounding areas, maybe a county sheriff, they work with those federal officers essentially as their full-time job. And, a lot of times you think to yourself, well, why would a police department do that? Like, everybody needs police officers. Like, why would you give like a police officer over to the feds? Well, a lot of times, the federal government has a grant and actually sometimes pays the salary, equipment, overtime for those officers. So there's some financial incentive, and usually there's some problem in the area. So the Columbus Police Department, for example, might say, hey, listen, we have all of these fugitives, people who've skipped bail, but they have like these felony warrants. We actually don't have time as the Columbus Police Department to go out and arrest all of these people, but we're actually going to put 1 or 2 officers for this, and they're going to work with the feds and other agencies. So here's this kind of big problem when it comes to people with these felony warrants, and they're going to help us out with this. So you can see that there's some benefit for the community as well, which is why they have these federal task forces. With the Albuquerque Police Department, I believe we had a task force with the FBI and with the ATF as well. I think that's really common. So anyways, Officer Mead, he is part of a task force. So when it comes to this, he typically isn't driving a police car. He's not in uniform. typically these officers are in plain clothes, but they either have a vest that says, police or U.S. Marshals, or they have some type of a jacket that says that to indicate that they are law enforcement. So he was driving, Officer Meade was driving in an unmarked car, and as he was driving, here's what he claims. He claims that as he was driving, he passed by a car that was driven by a 23-year-old man named Casey Goodson. The Officer Meade says that as they passed by each other, kind of on a side street, then Mr. Goodson pulled out a handgun and basically was waving a handgun at him as they were driving by. Well, being part of a fugitive task force where they go after people with felony warrants, you see that might raise suspicion of an officer in that kind of an area. So what the officer did is he basically he pulled behind the car, he stopped, and he kind of followed the car. Once Mr. Goodson got out of the car, the officer claims that Mr. Goodson pretty much started running away to a house. Well, Officer Meade says that he was identifying himself as a federal agent. He already saw that that he was a law enforcement officer working with this task force. And Officer Meade said that as Mr. Goodson was just about to enter this house, that he pulled out the handgun and actually pointed the handgun at the police officer. Officer Meade said that in response to having the handgun pointed at him, that he did fire 6 different rounds, and 5 of them hit Mr. Goodson. So that's basically the facts of that case. Now, let me tell you what that's what Officer Meade said is the facts of that case. So the house that Mr. Goodson was going to was his grandmother's house. So he had a legal reason to be at that house. There's no issue with him going to that house. And here's what some of the things that the family member said. And really what the dispute is over whether or not Mr. Goodson actually was pointing a gun at the police officer. So there isn't a dispute whether or not he had a gun, because the evidence is that, once the shooting started, that Mr. Goodson actually took a couple steps into the house, and he actually died right there in the kitchen. Well, basically what the evidence shows is that there was actually a handgun next to him as he laid there in the kitchen once he had passed away. So we know that he had a gun. And if you listen to what his family said, and the family attorney says for Mr. Goodson, is that yes, he had a gun. He does have a concealed carry permit, and the gun was holstered. Essentially, it was in the pants holster, and that's where the gun was. And that after he was shot, that the gun fell out. So that's basically what the family is saying. They're saying that in his hands, he actually had holding a sandwich and his car keys in his hand. Now, Officer Meade is saying, no. He had the handgun in his hand. He pointed it at me, and that's why I fired my weapon. I'm not firing a weapon because he was holding a sandwich and car keys. No. Like, he had a gun, and it was pointed at me. But that's what the two sides are saying, and the DA actually charged the officer with murder. So he's on trial right now for murder. He actually testified last week in his own defense. It was pretty interesting to see what was said in that trial. Like I said, the trial does pick up again on Tuesday, and I guess a lot of these officer-involved shootings, yes, they are complicated. There's a lot of issues, but when we're talking, especially in a setting like this, this case really comes down to one question: if Mr. Goodson had a gun and pointed at the officer, then it's a reasonable, justified shooting. If Mr. Goodson didn't have the handgun in his hand and the gun was in a holster in his pants, then I'm going to say it's probably not a reasonable and justified officer-involved shooting. That's really what this boils down to. So now let's look at what the evidence says. What does the evidence say? Well, when Mr. Goodson fell to the ground, the gun wasn't in the holster. The gun was on the ground next to him, like he had been holding it. And, I'm really curious to see what some of you people think on here. So I carry off duty. I have forever. I carry off duty. And I carry in the pants holster as well, meaning that the holster goes inside your pants instead of one that like a police officer would have where it's like a holster that goes outside. It's easier to conceal that way. So what I'm asking to see, what I'm asking here is that, in all my situations, not just working as a police officer, again, I was on the street for about 15 years in uniform, and then I was a detective for 4 years, but, working in a big violent city where a lot of people are carrying guns, I've never seen a situation, and correct me if I'm wrong, or if someone has seen this, I've never seen a situation where someone has an inside the pants holster, and as they're running or something happens, or they get into a fight, where the gun just flies out. Like, I've never seen that happen, so to me, that doesn't doesn't seem very reasonable. And I'm gonna use a couple examples. I know this is just from my personal life, but I also trail run. I trail run approximately 20 miles a week. I go up in the mountains here in Albuquerque and I run. And there were two different times where I fell pretty bad. The last time I fell was about 18 months ago. I was coming down the mountain and I fell so bad that I broke my nose. It was real silly. I fell as I was going. I tripped on a rock and my face smashed on a rock and I broke my nose as I was running. That was a pretty bad fall. I've had other bad falls, but that was probably my worst fall. I was carrying a gun that time as I fell. The gun didn't come out. Didn't come out at all. There were other times where I was running in much more steeper areas where I also fell. And after I fell, I kind of like slid down the mountain on the trail. And, if anyone ever saw me do it, it would probably be funny because I probably looked ridiculous when it happened. But again, in that situation, my gun didn't fall out. So I guess the idea that the gun would just be in a holster, inside the pants holster, and that you would fall back and the gun would just fly out doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So to me, it seems like the evidence is pointing towards is that Mr. Goodson was holding the gun in his hand, and at least that's what happened when the officer-involved shooting happened. If someone is holding a gun and pointing it at you, that's probably a legal and reasonable officer-involved shooting. I'm curious to see what you guys think about this, but to me, it seems like that Officer Meade, if that's the case, it seems like the evidence is pointing towards that this was a reasonable, lawful, and justified officer-involved shooting, and hopefully he is not convicted. All right, let's see what some of these comments are. So James Echo says, James is watching from communist-controlled California. Let's see, Kuros234 says, not a very well-retaining holster, if that was true. Agree, and it's possible. So Kuros, I'm gonna let you know. So again, Mr. Goodson, I don't know anything about his criminal history or anything like that. But what I do know is he does have a concealed carry license. So he did go. So he isn't just like a random person who doesn't have any kind of firearms training or any kind of a classes. That just picked up a gun and just stuck it in his pants. I mean, he went through the trouble to get a concealed carry license. So the idea that he had a concealed carry permit and he's having a holster where it could just fly out, to me that doesn't make sense. Now I think Cajun Randy has a good point. Holding it and pointing it at you are two different things. I agree with you 100%, Cajun Randy. Holding it and pointing it are two different things. So let's go down that rabbit hole, Cajun Randy. So the family is saying he wasn't holding it all. The family is saying the gun was in the holster, he never had it in his hand, and the gun just fell out. So if we can get to a point where we agree that that's silly, right? That's like Barack Obama says, that is silly season. Like, okay, that didn't happen. So he was holding. Okay, so now we get to a point where he was holding. So now who do we believe? Okay, we have an officer who says, no, he was holding it and he pointed it. And then we have a family who says, no, it was actually it was in the holster, but it just fell out as he flew back. So again, what seems more reasonable? And I agree with you, Cajun Randy. Holding it and pointing it are two different things. However, you have to think to yourself, so he gets out of the car. He's being followed by a police officer who's saying he's a police officer who has a vest that says U.S. Marshal. So you're saying he had sandwich and a keys in his hand. So you're saying that, so basically what they're trying to say is that, okay, in that situation where he's being given commands from a police officer, he pulls out a gun but doesn't point it. Again, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? So why are you pulling a gun out on a police officer? So this isn't making a whole lot of sense. Again, I've been carrying off duty for 19 years. I've never once pulled out my gun for any reason off duty. And if I was being told from a police officer, like that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Yeah, Cajun Randy, yeah, Casey's not there to tell a story. I agree, Cajun Randy. Yeah, that's why all we have is the evidence. And again, what the family and the family attorney is saying happened, at least to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It makes sense what the officer is saying. Otherwise, what you're saying is, hey, this police officer who's been on the police force for 17 years, he's never been involved in a bad shooting. He doesn't have a bad in internal affairs complaints. He's never been involved in any other police shooting. And this one day, he decided to kill someone for no reason. Again, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense either. So again, I'm just trying to see what happened. There is body cam footage of the incident. However, it's not being released right now. That's how it works in Ohio, at least in this area, essentially, that the jury and the judge have been allowed to see the body camera footage. However, that's not being released to the public. I really hope it does get released because, as you know, I love body camera footage. Let's see. Sog68 says, I started carrying when I was 19 years old, and 95% of the time I used inside the pants holster with no retention and never had a fallout. Sog68, thank you so much. That's been my experience as well. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Again, I've had some pretty bad falls, and again, some pretty bad falls. And while trail running with my off-duty handgun, and it's never just fallen out. That's not, and again, working on the street as a cop for 15 years on the street, that's just something I've never seen. It's possible, but I'm really curious to see what some of your thoughts are. Let's see, Thog68 worked at a pawn shop, so I was legally carrying. Yeah, so we will keep you updated on that. So like I said, since the trial picks up again on Tuesday, I could see Officer Mead's trial somehow concluding this next week, and if we have some kind of a verdict, we'll go ahead and talk about it on Friday, but that's one of the cases. So that's a lot of times on this channel and other channels, we talk about controversial officer-involved shootings, really just as honest as I can be, because they're more interesting. When we have issues like this to talk about, and this is a case where, again, if Casey Goodson, if the handgun was not if what the family says is true, and there's some evidence that he was never holding the gun, that's an argument to be made that this was not a legal shooting, and I'm good with saying that. But again, there's some discrepancy here. Obviously, there's some discrepancy if the police officer is being charged. So a lot of the time, those are the kinds of cases that we cover, and I think we should, because we can go back and forth and we can argue and we could say, well, if this happened, then it's reasonable. If not, then it's not reasonable. I really like to have those kinds of discussions on this channel, and I think that you do too, because that's really it's interesting to talk about these things. But the reality is the vast majority of officer-involved shooting cases are reasonable, legal, justified. Even people who are dishonest and anti-police activists who look at it would pretty much have to say, yeah, I get it, that's legal, I don't have any issue with that. And that's really more representative of what actually happens with officer-involved shootings. And there was a case this week that happened in New York City that, unless you live in New York City, you probably haven't heard about, you probably won't hear about. But really, this is the reality of officer-involved shootings, and it's just because you don't hear about it doesn't mean that this isn't what normally happens. So this is far more representative of when police officers utilize deadly force, and this case is an excellent example of that. But again, because it's obviously a reasonable and justified shooting, you're not going to hear about it anywhere, so I'm going to tell you about it. So this happened in New York City back on December 3rd, and essentially there was a call for service where police officers in New York City were called to a stabbing call. An individual had stabbed 4 different people to death, including 2 children. So there were 4 people who were stabbed to death, including 2 children. Police officers were dispatched to that scene. They set up a perimeter around it. They did not have any kind of offender in custody at this point. So homicide detectives were there on scene. Crime scene investigators were there. Essentially, they were investigating the scene. There were 2 different police officers. There were more than 2, but at least at this one point, because when there's a crime scene, they have everything taped off, right? So there were 2 different police officers who were essentially at this one point maintaining by the crime scene tape, essentially just making sure that no one doesn't go into the perimeter. They weren't investigators. They weren't trying to figure out who solved this. Literally, these cops, their only job is, hey, stand there at that corner and make sure that no one goes into the perimeter. That's all they were doing. Well, they were out there for a couple hours, and they realized that there was this guy named Courtney Gordon, and he was kind of just hanging out for hours. And there weren't a whole lot of people there. So since he was just kind of hanging out on the crime scene, the police officer started to talk to him. Just like, hey, where do you live? Just like basic it's on body camera, just pretty basic, reasonable conversation. They had no idea that Mr. Gordon, he was the offender of this. The officers had no idea that was the case, or anything like that. So as they're having this normal conversation, asking about, where he lives, or is he local? Is he a neighbor? Is he a witness? All these regular random conversation. All of a sudden during this conversation, Mr. Gordon pulls out a knife and he stabs both police officers quick. it happened so fast. Neither of the police officers have any weapon systems in their hand because, again, they think he's just a normal guy, kind of just like a curious, looky-loo kind of guy, just waiting around the crime scene to see what's happening. So it's a normal, reasonable conversation. He's not under arrest. He's not being detained. They weren't giving him any commands. They were literally just having a normal conversation with him. And about 30 seconds into that conversation, and he pulls out a knife and he stabs both police officers. Immediately, both police officers pull out their guns. Even though they are injured, they pull pull out their handguns and they fire and they actually kill Mr. Gordon. Well, it turns out that Mr. Gordon, he was the offender of this. Kind of the backstory behind it is that Mr. Gordon, he was a homeless guy. Unhoused. He was an unhoused guy. He didn't have anywhere to go. And the people who lived in that house, those were his family members. I think it was his cousin. Those were his family members. And essentially, they felt bad for him. They let him stay in the house. He ends up killing 2 adults and 2 children at knife point. He stabs them to death. Police officers did not having any idea that he was the offender. After he stabbed both officers, the officers did shoot him and kill him. And again, this is far more representative of officer-involved shootings. So it's like this is a case where it's obviously this is a legal, reasonable, justified officer-involved shooting. The vast majority of officer-involved shootings, this is the kind of stuff that happens. Someone takes out a knife and stabs the officer after they committed a violent felony, and the police officers utilize deadly force in response. This is normally what happens in officer-involved shootings. And again, you're never going to hear about a case like this unless you're local. So I just want to go ahead and put that in there. But yeah, fuck around and find out. That's how most officer-involved shootings are. We don't cover all of them because, again, I think there's about 3 fatal officer-involved shootings every day in the country, somewhere around there. And again, this is how the vast majority of them are. We don't cover them that often. But when I saw this one in the news and I watched the body camera video, I said, who think we might want to hear about this case? Our audience over at Cop Watch TV. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this last case. This last case, this is a case that I've covered before, but every time I cover this case, whether I write an article over on my Substack or I put up a post on X or on Instagram, for whatever reason, this is one of those. This is one of those cases that every time I post about, I get people on both sides. Honestly, more of the side that the cops did the wrong thing than anything. I get more comments and really interaction on this case. So anytime there is some kind of a significant update, I always talk about it because, again, if anything, this is a case that people are interested in. So this was the case that happened in Farmington, New Mexico last year, April of 23. So again, and I'm going to give you the update here at the end, but this was the case where, and this actually made national news as well. It was on Inside Edition and CNN and stuff this week, the update that I'm going to talk about. So again, this is a national story, not just a local one. So this happened in Farmington, New Mexico. Just for a little geography, Farmington, New Mexico is approximately 3 hours north of Albuquerque, pretty close to the Colorado border. There was a call of a domestic violence call. So it was a domestic dispute. Police officers were dispatched to an address. As police officers got there, they went to a house that was not the house in question. So essentially, this was, late at night, 11, 12, 1 in the morning, something like that. It was dark outside. It was late at night. Officers were supposed to go to 5308, whatever street. Instead of going to 5308, they went to 5305. Police officers knock on the door. They knock on the door and they say Farmington Police, and they're basically there for about 1 minute and 22 seconds. So not even a minute and a half. 1 minute and 22 seconds, they're on the porch. In that minute and 22 seconds, they knock on the door 3 different times, and they say Farmington Police 3 different times. After about the 3rd time they knock, one of the officers says, hey, I think we're supposed to be at 5305, not 5308. And the one officer gets on the radio and he confirms with dispatch. He said, hey, can you repeat the address to this? And it's at that point, while they're waiting for dispatch to essentially get back to the officers to let them know if they're at the right house or not, they say to themselves, okay, let's go back to the car and kind of figure this out, thinking, okay, you know what, we probably are here at the wrong house. So they take a couple steps back. One officer moves quicker than the other one, but they start walking back to their cars. It's at that point that the door swings open and the homeowner, a 52-year-old guy named Robert Dotson, he swings open the door and he has a gun pointed right at the officers. Well, the officers, with a gun pointed at them, immediately fire their weapons in response. Then the officers are able to retreat kind of, closer back to their cars. They call out that they were an officer-involved shooting. Mr. Dotson's wife, she comes and she claims she doesn't know what's going on. Let's take her word for it. She doesn't know what's going on. All she knows that her husband was just in a shooting with someone. She has her own gun and she starts firing rounds at the police officers as well. Well, in response, the police officers fire rounds at her. Eventually, she realizes that these are police officers. She stops firing her weapon. The police officers stop firing their weapon. Thankfully, she was not hit, and the officers were not hit either. However, the 52-year-old Mr. Dotson, he does end up dying from his injuries. I said at the very beginning, I wrote an article about it. I said, so it's documented. I said it on this show back in April. This was a legal and reasonable officer-involved shooting. Again, I get it. The police officers knocked on the wrong door. I get it. But here's the thing. There is nothing illegal or immoral about knocking on the wrong door. Pizza delivery guys do it all the time. Mailmen, Amazon, happens all the time. Police officers do it all the time. Sometimes police officers, sometimes strippers for bachelor parties, they do it all the time, okay? Sometimes police officers even knock on. So let me just start right here. The idea of calling it the wrong house, that's really irritating to me. I don't like that term. Here's why. Because again, there's nothing illegal or immoral about knocking on a door that is a different house than where the domestic violence was at. Here's my evidence for this. So there are a lot of different times when police officers are sent to a call. It could be a domestic violence. It could be a possible meth lab. It could be, think of 100 different reasons why police officers might go to a call. And a lot of times, police officers will knock on the door of a neighbor, of a witness, of someone who's not involved. Sometimes when I was a use of force investigator, if a police officer had a use of force in the middle of the street, part of my job would be to knock on all the doors in the neighborhood and say, hey, did you guys happen to see anything? Do you have any video surveillance? And you know what? Knocking on the wrong door or doors of houses of people who weren't involved, that was considered being thorough. That was considered being a good investigator. You could think for a second that, hey, if there's a domestic violence call here and it sounds like something's going on, it wouldn't be unreasonable for a police officer to try to contact someone else to see, hey, like, is this the case? Are there weapons in the house? You know, again, I can make an argument that a police officer doing this would actually be evidence that they are a good and thorough police officer. Okay, so saying that it's the wrong door is absolutely insane. Again, someone just commented, Patricia says that Amazon drivers don't carry weapons. True, they don't, I guess. But also Mr. Dotson, I should point out there that he had a Ring camera system that he obviously didn't look out, or he would have seen police officers. So I'm just going to say this one last time. Knocking, even if we called the wrong door, which again is irritating because it doesn't give the whole context of it. But let's just say that's how people are calling it. Knocking on it is not illegal, immoral, or against police department policy to knock on the wrong door. But you know what is illegal? Pointing a gun at someone who is standing on your porch doing nothing. You can't do that. You can't just point guns at people. That's called aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and it's a felony. And listen, if you point a gun at someone, then they may reasonably think that you are going to use that gun, and they might respond. So that doesn't make sense. Sog68, do you have a good comment? Don't answer the door late at night. And again, if someone knocks on your door and they said they didn't hear them say police, even though it's not like a Breonna Taylor thing where it's like the cops say one thing. Like, this is on body camera video that they said Farmington police 3 different times, and they knocked on the door. They weren't banging on the door. They weren't opening the door to try to get in, because the wife said recently on the news that, well, I thought someone was trying to break in. Is that how it works? Hang on a second. Is that how break-ins work? I get it's weird for someone to knock on your door, but again, the officers weren't jiggling the handle. They weren't pushing on the door. Like, they knocked on the door and said Farmington police. Okay, so the idea that you think someone's trying to break in doesn't make any sense. Again, let's say you do think someone is trying to break in your house, but you're not sure exactly who it is. So if you think someone's going to try to break in your house, you're not going to look at your Ring camera, which you have. You're not going to call the police. You're not going to look through the peephole to see who it is. You're going to fling the door open with a gun already pointed out. Again, I'm not saying Mr. Dotson's a bad guy. Okay, I'm not. But obviously, he did something that caused the police officers to utilize deadly force, and it was completely reasonable for the officers to utilize deadly force. I said this back in April. Recently, this was just investigated by the New Mexico Department of Justice, and the New Mexico Department of Justice has just said that they are not going to charge the police officers in this case. They said that the use of force from the officers was objectively reasonable. So the officers are not going to face any charges. Of course, this was the right thing to do. However, because you never know when politics get involved, you never really know how these cases are going to go. So, there are a lot of cases like the one we did earlier with Officer Meade, where I don't think the officers should have been charged. Well, this is a case where, this one went the right way. An officer, even though it was a highly publicized national case, I feel like the New Mexico Department of Justice, that they really did a thorough investigation. And at the end of it, they came to the right decision. And you know what? I think sometimes we can look at these cases and say this officer shouldn't be charged, that officer shouldn't be charged. But this is a case where it went right. Where I honestly believe that the prosecutors looked at the evidence and they were fair about what they did. And you know what? Let's take this one as a win. And sometimes you just have to take the win. This was the right decision from the New Mexico Department of Justice. And I'm glad that they did a thorough investigation on this case, because cases like this should be investigated fairly and thoroughly. Because if a police officer does commit a crime, they should be prosecuted. But this is a case where the officer did not. Let's see if we got any other comments on this. Let's see. Kuro says, if he was in fear for his safety, he should have stayed behind the locked door. Yes, 100%. He should have stayed behind the locked door. He should have looked out the peephole, looked out the window, looked at his Ring doorbell camera, called for police officers. There's 1,000 things that he should have done, because I want people like Mr. Dotson to be alive as well. And let me just say this. So if I got a knock on my door at 2 o'clock in the morning, it actually did happen once where it was actually a neighbor where I got a knock on the door. It was like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And that is jarring because no one is expecting a knock on the door that late. So before I went and I opened the door, I grabbed my gun. I absolutely did. I grabbed my gun. I went downstairs. My dogs are going crazy because I have 2 giant dogs. My dogs are going crazy, right? But I got my gun. I grabbed it. And I held my gun at my side. I looked out the peephole and I saw that it was a neighbor. So I cracked the door a little bit and I asked what they wanted. It was something reasonable and simple, and they went on their way. What I didn't do is, before looking out the window or before looking out the peephole, swing open the door wildly like I'm SEAL Team 6 and pointing the gun at who's ever out there. Like, I would never do that. Like, that's not reasonable. Again, even if it's jarring to be woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning, even if you think, hey, someone could have bad intentions, again, just swinging the door open wildly and pointing guns, again, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because there's a predictable reaction from who's ever on the other side of the door. And this time it happened to be police officers. Again, like I said, part of my job with Internal Affairs Force Division, part of like the policy is if there was a use of force, whether it was an empty handcuff takedown or a tasing or any use of force that I was investigating, I had to knock on all of the doors to see if there was any witnesses or if there was any surveillance video. This was me, per the department policy, being thorough in my investigation for use of force. So again, I knocked on a lot of doors at 2 o'clock in the morning for random people who had nothing to do with the use of force, because I was supposed to do it because I had to. And again, what if someone had video surveillance of a case like of the use of force, and I was lazy and I didn't get it? That could be pertinent evidence. One more comment here. Let's see. Daryl Smith says, however, it could be possible that the elderly couple may have had prior trouble with someone possibly harassing them after dark. We don't know. Daryl Smith, really good comment, and I agree. So first of all, he was 53. I'm 41. So this guy was 52 or 53 years old. Don't think he was elderly, but I should say that yes, he had problems. I think his car had been stolen from the house in the past. Even if you think that it could be someone who was doing something negative outside the house, that's reasonable. I don't understand how you don't look through a peephole, you don't look through the window, how you don't look at your Ring camera. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Daryl, please don't apologize. I think you made a really good point. I think you made an excellent point, and thank you so much for your comment. So the officers are not going to be charged in that case. I think that was the right thing to do. All right, so that's going to be the last case that I cover, and I'm just going to leave this from, there was a long time when I was doing the show while I was working as an Albuquerque police officer where I really went out of my way to not cover anything local, which I think is reasonable, because again, not only was I working in internal investigations for the Albuquerque Police Department, but I didn't want there to be any kind of conflict of interest. But now that I'm retired from the police department, I feel like I'm at a point where I can talk about some things that are local, and I'm just going to touch on a case that happened that was covered by the local media here. Maybe we could put a link to the story on it. But essentially, this is just what I want you to think about. And it comes to police chases. So, normally I'm on the side of I don't want police officers to chase. Getting into high-speed chases, especially in areas where there's a lot of people or there's a lot of traffic, and if it's not a violent crime, a lot of times most of the time I fall on the side of, it's just not worth it. It's not worth it to put innocent people at risk. Well, we had a case in Albuquerque story a couple days ago where there was an individual he had stolen a car. So he was in a stolen truck. Police officers tried to stop him, and immediately he fled. Well, the Albuquerque Police Department, like a lot of major police departments, they only chase for a couple of different things. They only chase for a couple of different crimes. Usually, if it's homicide, criminal sexual assault, robbery, burglary, kidnapping, things like that. Police officers chase for, but they're not allowed to chase for stolen cars. And I get it. Like I said, I usually agree with that. But this is where a case where the police officers not chasing, it really had a bad effect on what happened. Here's what I mean by this. So the police officers, as soon as the guy started to run, as soon as that happened, police officers didn't chase. They didn't chase him at all. Police officers completely lost sight of the vehicle, which is what they were supposed to do per department policy. However, just because the police officer stopped chasing, that doesn't mean that the bad guy automatically knows, hey, the cops aren't chasing me anymore. So he kept driving like a fucking asshole, and he ended up crashing into a pedestrian who was walking in the street. He crashed into a pedestrian. His name was Dylan Lujan, and according to the criminal complaint, according to the criminal complaint, he sped up eastbound on pretty much the main street, which is Central. An Albuquerque police officer essentially didn't even get close to deploy what's called Star Chase, which is really great technology, which is basically something that we shoot at the car, and it's kind of like a sticky thing, and it sticks on the car. It has GPS, so that way we know exactly where the car is, so police officers don't have to get into high-speed chases. Essentially, where I'm going with this is the officer didn't even get close enough to deploy that Star Chase. So again, the police officers were not chasing. He ended up fleeing, and he crashed into an individual who did suffer some pretty serious injuries. And following the after he crashed and he killed and he hurt someone, he did go into a drainage tunnel. It was that point he fled into a drainage tunnel. It was that point that police officers did follow and chase him there after the serious crash. But I just want to point out that just because police officers don't. So is this a case where if the police officers were allowed to be a little bit more aggressive a little bit earlier, and maybe they were allowed to chase, maybe they were able to pit this immediately? Is this a case where we would have a pedestrian who wasn't seriously injured from someone who was running from police officers? So I think that's something to think about. And I don't blame the police officers on the street, right? Because the police officers, they followed policy. Police officers have to follow policy. We want them to follow policy. But I just think it's important to remember that we have to remember who the real bad guys are. And it's not the police officers who are trying to get these criminals into custody. It's people who are stealing cars and driving like maniacs and doing anything to get away from the officers. All right, so that's going to be the show for today. I want to thank everybody for participating and for asking really good questions. The link to the story is in the chat by ABQ Raw, and I hope that everyone has a great weekend, and we'll go ahead and see you next Friday. Thanks.